All right, buckle up, everyone. Today's deep dive is going to take us down some pretty fascinating rabbit holes. We're tackling the hidden globe, how wealth hacks the world. Just from skimming it, it's clear this isn't your typical travel brochure.
Oh, absolutely. We're going way beyond the usual stuff you hear about, Wall Street, stock markets.
Exactly. This book dives into the spaces where wealth plays by a completely different set of rules, almost its own world hidden in plain sight.
Kind of makes you wonder what you've been missing, right?
Right. Okay, so before we jump in, let's talk about the author a bit, Atossa Araxia Abrahamian.
Yeah, her background is kind of key to understanding this book, I think.
Totally. Growing up in those super international environments like the UN,
Yeah.
you can just tell that gives her this insider's view on how, like, the global elite actually operate.
That definitely comes across. It's not just like dry economic theory, right? It's full of stories, firsthand observations, stuff that makes these ideas really click.
Absolutely. So, ready to dive into chapter one? It's called City of Holes, and it takes us to Geneva.
Okay, Geneva. Now, when you hear that, what pops into your head?
Chocolate. Those fancy watches. Maybe international organizations like the Red Cross.
Right, that peaceful, neutral vibe. But Abrahamian flips that script. She shows us the other side of Geneva, the one that's all about hidden wealth, power moves happening behind closed doors.
It's crazy, right? You have this image of Geneva as a humanitarian hub, and then bam, there's this whole other reality operating in parallel where it's a major player in offshore finance, tax havens, all that shady stuff.
Mm. And that duality is baked into Geneva's history. It's always been a place that drew in people escaping persecution, going all the way back to religious refugees in the 1500s and even political dissidents in the 20th century. And those folks didn't just come alone, they brought their money with them.
It makes sense, right? It's like this safe haven for capital. And over time, that created this super unique financial system, one that's both discreet and, honestly, incredibly powerful. Geneva's place in the global money machine, it's tangled up with some pretty dark stuff, from like early bankers financing colonialism to the more recent controversies over tax havens and money laundering.
Definitely, it's a complicated picture.
And Abrahamian lays it all out there. One example that really stuck with me was the demoiselles. Have you ever heard that term used in like a financial context?
Not your everyday Wall Street jargon, that's for sure.
Right.
So basically, demoiselles were these financial instruments, but get this, they were built around the lives of young girls. Their dowries, inheritance, all of that was packaged up and actually traded on the market.
It's chilling, right? It's a perfect example of how these abstract financial ideas can have a very real impact on people's lives, and often not in a good way.
Totally. And it all circles back to this theme of accountability, or rather, the lack of it, that runs through the whole book.
Totally. And speaking of accountability, Abrahamian brings up John Ziegler, this Swiss politician who was super critical of his own country's financial practices.
Right. He basically argued that Switzerland, and Geneva specifically, was contributing to global suffering because of its role as a tax haven and a hub for hidden wealth.
Yeah, and that critique is so important because it really exposes the tension between Geneva's image as this champion for peace and human rights, and then its role in a system that often just makes inequality and injustice worse.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Okay, moving on to chapter two, good fences.
Now we're stepping inside the Geneva Freeport. This place sounds straight out of a movie.
It really does. It's like almost outside of normal time and space. Imagine a massive warehouse packed with crazy valuable art, rare wines, gold, all stored in these climate-controlled vaults, guarded by like top-notch security.
It was initially meant for stuff in transit, like, perishable goods needing temporary storage.
Right.
But it turned into something way more interesting.
Oh, for sure. It's all because the Freeport offers this unique combo of physical security and then legal ambiguity.
It's a place where things can be stored forever, outside of customs rules, and with a ton of anonymity. And that makes it, well, pretty appealing for wealthy people and companies who want to shield their assets from taxes, creditors, or even just public scrutiny.
It's like a black box in the heart of Europe.
Yeah.
And this is where guys like Yves Bouvier come in. He was this seemingly normal art shipper who became a major player in the global art market, mostly by using the Freeport system.
Right. Bouvier's story is such a fascinating example of how the Freeport can be used to gain wealth and power. He basically became this middleman, connecting buyers and sellers in the super high-stakes art world, all while operating in this, like, shadowy, unregulated space.
But like many people who get involved in that world, His story doesn't end well.
Not at all. He had legal battles, accusations of fraud, and in the end, he had to sell off many of his ventures.
It's a cautionary tale about how alluring and dangerous the hidden globe can be. And it shows how the line between being clever and being illegal can get really blurry in these spaces. Speaking of blurred lines, Chapter 3, White Cube, Black Box, takes us to Singapore.
Ah, Singapore. Their transformation from a small island to a global financial powerhouse, that's incredible. They were smart about it, embracing free trade, welcoming foreign investment, making it super business-friendly, attracting capital from everywhere.
So many countries have tried to copy that. But what sets Singapore apart, at least according to Abrahamian, is their willingness to, really push the limits, find creative ways to attract and keep wealth.
Yeah, they're not afraid to think outside the box.
Exactly. And one of those ways was setting up their own free port, modeled after the one in Geneva.
Makes sense.
This was a very deliberate move. Singapore wanted to become a major hub in the global art market, and the free port was a key part of that strategy.
It's a way to draw in the super rich, generate buzz, and ultimately boost the economy.
Exactly. And it worked, at least for a while. But even Singapore, with their reputation for efficiency and following the rules, couldn't completely avoid the problems that seemed to follow these free port zones.
Nope, no one can. There were accusations of money laundering, tax evasion, and concerns about the lack of transparency. And in the end, the Singapore Freeport was sold off, kind of symbolically, to a cryptocurrency billionaire.
Wow.
Yeah.
It shows that the world of wealth and power is always changing, and that even the most well-designed systems can be disrupted.
Absolutely. Nothing stays the same forever.
But Singapore's experiment with the free port also highlights another big theme in the book, this fascination with the hack.
Right. These spaces, whether it's a free port, a tax haven, or any zone operating outside the normal rules, they're all about hacking the system, finding loopholes, exploiting the gaps between national laws.
Yeah. And for people with the resources and the know-how to navigate those systems, it's incredibly appealing. It's all about bending the rules, finding the edges of the system, and pushing against them.
They're always looking for an edge.
Exactly. And that brings us to Chapter 4, In the Zones, where we shift gears a bit and look at a different kind of zone, the Export Processing Zone, or EPZ.
Okay, so EPZs are these designated areas, usually in developing countries, that offer special incentives to attract foreign investment, typically in manufacturing. They often have relaxed labor laws, tax breaks, streamlined regulations, all designed to make it easier and cheaper for companies to set up shop and produce goods for export.
The idea is to boost economic growth, create jobs, and help those countries develop.
Right, sounds good on paper.
Yeah, but as Abrahamian explores, the reality is often much more complicated. And it's interesting that she brings in the perspective of Claude de Baissac, who actually worked on setting up these EPZs.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He really believed in the potential of EPZs to do good, but over time he became disillusioned by their limitations and the unintended consequences.
He saw firsthand how these zones could turn into places of exploitation, where workers were treated poorly, wages were kept low, and environmental rules were ignored.
Yeah, not what they signed up for.
Definitely not. And he also saw how EPZs could make inequality worse, both within countries and globally. It's a classic case of good intentions gone wrong. It shows the tension between the promise of economic development and the reality of global capitalism.
Yeah, there's always a gap between the ideal and what actually happens.
Always. But one of the most surprising things Abrahamian points out about EPZs is the role of UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization.
Now that is interesting.
Right. UNIDO is supposed to promote sustainable development and strengthen national sovereignty, but they ended up being one of the biggest supporters of EPZs. And that's ironic because EPZs often undermine sovereignty by giving foreign corporations so much power within these zones.
It's like they're working against their own goals.
It's a great example of how initiatives that seem well-intentioned can be co-opted and used to serve the interests of those who already have power.
Absolutely. The powerful always find a way.
Okay, let's move on to Chapter 5, Hacking the World. Now we're getting into some really ambitious stuff. Abrahamian introduces this idea of charter cities. Can you explain what those are?
Okay, so charter cities are like brand new cities built from scratch, often in developing countries. And the key is they're governed by different rules than the country they're in. The idea, which was championed by this economist, Paul Romer, is that you can create pockets of prosperity by bringing in successful legal systems and institutions from other places.
So you're basically building a mini Singapore or Hong Kong, but with a custom set of rules designed to attract investment and drive economic growth.
Yeah, it's pretty radical trying to hack the traditional model of nation states and development.
Totally. And that's both what makes it so attractive and what makes it so difficult.
Exactly.
Romer argued that charter cities could be a solution to global poverty, a fresh start, a way to bypass the often corrupt and inefficient systems in many developing countries.
Yeah, that was his big idea.
But his attempts to actually put it into practice have had, well, mixed results. He ran into all sorts of political and ethical roadblocks. The idea of giving control of a piece of land to a foreign entity, even with the promise of economic benefits, raises concerns about sovereignty, accountability, and who really wins in the end.
Yeah, there are a lot of potential downsides.
It's a perfect example of the complexities and contradictions you find in the hidden globe. The desire for progress, for innovation, often clashes with the realities of power, politics, and the unequal distribution of resources.
It's a constant struggle.
And that tension between idealism and pragmatism, between good intentions and unintended consequences, it's something we see over and over again in the book.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme.
So with that in mind, let's move on to Chapter 6, The City in the City. This takes us to one of those places that really embodies the idea of hacking the world, the Dubai International Financial Center, or DIFC.
Ah, Dubai. They're already known for pushing the boundaries with architecture, engineering, and of course, finance. But the DIFC takes it to a whole other level. It's basically a legal island within Dubai with its own independent court system and a set of laws borrowed from other places.
So you have this super modern zone that's designed to attract international businesses and investors by offering a stable, predictable legal environment.
Yeah.
But it's totally separate from the legal system of the country it's in.
It's a weird kind of legal free port.
Right. It's like a legal free port, a place where the rules of the game are different, made for the needs of a global elite.
Makes you wonder who gets to make the rules, right?
Right. But it also raises a fundamental question. What does it mean for the law of the land when that land is no longer tied to a specific place or a traditional idea of sovereignty?
It's a question that's becoming more and more important as we see more of these special zones popping up around the world.
Exactly.
The DIFC model has been copied and exported, and it's changing how legal jurisdiction works in a globalized world.
It's a testament to the power of the hack, the appeal of finding ways to bypass traditional systems and create new spaces with their own rules.
And that power can be used for good or bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it also raises concerns about accountability, transparency, and the potential for these zones to be used for things that aren't so great. And with that, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the hidden globe.
Yeah, this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to explore.
Well, just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Last time we were talking about how wealth creates its own spaces, its own rules, even its own legal systems. But what happens when those spaces go beyond the boundaries of Earth?
Well, that's exactly where Chapter 7 takes us, ad astra. It's a look at Luxembourg. They're making some pretty ambitious moves into space mining, trying to position themselves as, like, the center of this future space economy.
Luxembourg. Space mining. It seems like a bit of an odd combo, doesn't it?
It might seem that way at first, but when you dig a little deeper, it kind of makes sense. Luxembourg has this history of reinventing itself. They used to be all about steel, but they strategically shifted to become a financial powerhouse. They used their small size and flexibility to their advantage, attracting international businesses and capital.
So they're taking that same adaptable approach and aiming it at space.
Exactly. They've already become a leader in satellite communications and financial services for the space industry.
Wow.
And now they're setting their sights on asteroids, seeing them as, like, the next big thing for resource extraction. They've even created laws that encourage private investment in space mining, offering tax breaks and incentives to get companies to set up shop in Luxembourg.
It's a bold move, no doubt. But it raises some tricky questions, right? Like, ethically and legally, what happens when we try to take our Earth-based systems of property rights and resource extraction and apply them to, like, celestial bodies?
It's a debate that's only just starting. The existing international treaties about space, like the Outer Space Treaty, are kind of vague when it comes to commercial exploitation of resources. And then there's the whole idea of the common heritage of mankind, which suggests that space should benefit all of humanity, not just a few.
It's a fascinating dilemma. On one hand, there's the potential for incredible scientific discoveries and economic opportunities, but on the other, there's the risk that we'll just repeat the same mistakes we've made on Earth, with exploitation and environmental damage.
It's a tough balance to strike.
And Luxembourg's ambitions in space highlight another theme that runs throughout the book, this tension between what individual countries want and what global governance can actually achieve.
Yeah, these hidden globes often operate in this gray area. They're outside the traditional frameworks of nation states, but they're also not fully subject to any kind of overarching international authority.
It's a recipe for both opportunity and conflict. Now, speaking of gray areas, Chapter 8, Titanic, takes us into the world of flags of convenience. This is something that's been around for a while, but it's still surprisingly relevant today. Can you break down what that's all about?
Sure. It's basically about how ships can register in countries that have really relaxed regulations, often to avoid taxes, labor laws, or safety standards.
So it's like finding a legal loophole that lets ship owners play by a different set of rules than the ones in their own country, or even the countries where they do business.
Exactly. It's another way to hack the system and operate in a more favorable environment.
But it's not just some abstract legal maneuver, right? It has real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Flags of convenience have been linked to all sorts of problems, from environmental disasters to human rights abuses. Ships flying these flags are often involved in oil spills, illegal fishing, and dumping hazardous waste. And because they're operating under the radar, it's really hard to hold them accountable.
Abrahamian traces the history of this practice back to American businessmen in the early 1900s. They were looking for ways to cut costs and avoid regulations. And she talks about Edward Stettinius, who was a big part of making Liberia a major flag of convenience haven.
Liberia is a classic example of how this system works. They make a lot of money from their maritime registry, even though they don't actually have much shipping infrastructure or oversight. It's basically a pay-to-play system where ship owners can just pay a fee to register their vessels under the Liberian flag and take advantage of their loose regulations.
It sounds almost too easy.
It kind of is, and Abrahamian uses the story of the Odessa Sky to really illustrate the problems with flags of convenience. This ship changed names and flags multiple times throughout its history. It started out as this symbol of post-Cold War hope, hosting lavish parties and cruises, but then it got caught up in legal battles, faced accusations of not paying its crew, and eventually ended up being scrapped in a really controversial way.
It's a wild story.
Yeah, and it highlights the lack of transparency, the difficulty in holding ship owners accountable, and the human and environmental costs of operating in this shadowy world. It goes back to a point that Abrahamian makes throughout the book. These hidden globes aren't just about money and abstract legal tricks. They have a real impact on people's lives, often in very direct ways.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of profit and the desire to get around the rules can have devastating consequences for the people who are most vulnerable. And this leads us to Chapter 9, Excised, where Abrahamian tackles one of the darkest sides of the hidden globe, using offshore spaces to detain and control people.
Yeah, this chapter is really powerful because it shifts the focus from the movement of money to the movement of people. Abrahamian focuses on Australia's immigration policies, specifically how they use offshore detention centers to hold asylum seekers who arrive by boat.
These centers are located on remote islands, far from the Australian mainland, and the conditions there are often described as horrific. Asylum seekers are held indefinitely, with very limited access to legal help or medical care.
It's a clear example of how the same principles of legal loopholes and jurisdictional ambiguity that we see in the financial world can be used to justify the inhumane treatment of people who are just trying to find safety. These islands basically become legal black holes where human rights are ignored and the rule of law is distorted.
And Abrahamian tells the story of Aziz Muhammad, a refugee from Sudan, who was detained on Manus Island for 6 years. He became a vocal advocate for the rights of refugees and even went to Geneva to receive a human rights award.
Wow.
But even with all that recognition, he decided to stay in Switzerland rather than risk being sent back to detention in Australia. His story is both inspiring but deeply troubling too.
Yeah, it's a powerful indictment of a system that treats asylum seekers as bargaining chips in a political game.
It's a reminder that the hidden globe isn't just about wealth and power. It's about the human cost of these systems, the lives that are disrupted, the dreams that are shattered, and the fundamental rights that are denied. And as we move on to Chapter 10, Las Vegas, we see a slightly different take on the hidden globe, although the themes of exploitation and legal ambiguity are still there. Abrahamian takes us to Botan, a special economic zone in Laos. It was supposed to be a booming center for trade and tourism, but it's become a cautionary tale.
Botan is a really strange place. It's on the border between Laos and China, and it's been heavily influenced by Chinese investment and development. They even changed their time zone to match Beijing time, which shows just how much external forces have shaped this zone.
And it was supposed to be this glamorous casino town, a Las Vegas of Southeast Asia. But the reality is totally different.
The casinos are mostly empty, the construction projects are unfinished, and the whole place feels kind of eerie and deserted. And behind the facade, there are stories of exploitation, of workers being brought in from other countries and treated terribly.
Abrahamian talks about the Thai lady boys who were brought in to work in the entertainment industry, and they often face discrimination and abuse. It's a reminder that even in these seemingly glamorous places, the darker side of the hidden globe is never far away.
It's always lurking beneath the surface.
And Botan is a stark contrast to the idea that special economic zones are these engines of growth and prosperity.
It shows the risks of relying too heavily on foreign investment, the potential for corruption, and what can happen when these ventures fail.
And as we'll see in the next chapter, this desire to create special zones, these places that operate outside the normal rules, is spreading to some pretty remote places on Earth, bringing with it both exciting possibilities and some serious ethical challenges.
It's a whole new frontier with all its unknowns.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Welcome back to our deep dive into the hidden globe. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we? From the high-security vaults of Geneva's Freeport to the shadowy world of ships flying flags of convenience. We even took a detour to a would-be Las Vegas in Laos.
It's been a whirlwind tour of these hacked spaces, as Abrahamian calls them, each one showing us a different way that wealth and power operate in the 21st century.
Like peeking behind the curtain, seeing how the world really works.
Exactly. And just when you think you've seen it all, Abrahamian takes us to a place that's totally different from anything we've encountered so far.
Chapter 11, Terra Nullius, takes us to the Arctic, specifically to Svalbard. Now, this isn't a zone built on secrecy or like legal loopholes. It's actually governed by this international treaty that says anyone from any signatory nation can live and work there.
It's like the opposite of all these other zones we've been talking about, right? A place where borders are supposed to be meaningless.
It's a fascinating anomaly, especially in a world that seems obsessed with borders and restrictions. And Svalbard's history is this interesting mix of strategic interests, individual ambition, and then this surprising commitment to openness.
A lot of different forces at play.
A key figure in that history is John Monroe Longyear, an American businessman who saw the potential of Svalbard's coal deposits way back in the early 1900s. He started a mining company, built a settlement, and basically set the stage for the Svalbard we see today.
It's interesting, right? He wasn't driven by some grand humanitarian vision. He was a businessman, a capitalist looking for an opportunity.
Right.
But his actions, along with all the geopolitical maneuvering of different countries, ended up creating this remarkably open and unique space.
It's a place where Norwegians, Russians, Poles, scientists, tourists, they can all live and work together.
It's a pretty amazing concept.
But that openness also creates some challenges. There are concerns about too much tourism, environmental damage, and this tension between trying to maintain a Norwegian community and upholding the treaty's promise of non-discrimination.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act.
It makes you wonder if a place can truly stay open and welcoming in a world that seems to be becoming more closed off and divided.
It's a big question.
Svalbard is kind of like a counterpoint to all the other zones we've explored in the hidden globe. But it also shows how difficult it is to maintain that kind of openness in a world that's driven by competition, scarcity, and self-interest.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the hidden globe, what are some of the key things you think listeners should take away from all of this?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that Abrahamian has given us a new way of seeing the world. These hidden globes, these spaces that operate outside the normal rules, they're everywhere. And they affect our lives in ways we might not even realize.
Like she's pulled back the curtain and shown us the machinery that's running behind the scenes.
Exactly. And she's encouraging us to pay attention, to look beyond the surface, to understand the systems that govern these spaces, and to ask some tough questions about who benefits and who gets left behind.
It's not always pretty, right?
Not always. These hacks, these clever manipulations of legal systems and geographical boundaries, they can be used for good or for bad. They can be used for innovation, for progress, even for humanitarian purposes. But they can also be used for exploitation, for evading responsibility, for concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a few.
There's always that potential for abuse.
Always. And that's where the ethical questions come in. Abrahamian doesn't give us easy answers, but she makes us think about the complexities, the trade-offs, and what kind of world we want to live in.
I think one of the most important points she makes is that the spaces between borders are just as important as the borders themselves. And as the world becomes more interconnected, as technology blurs the lines between physical and digital spaces, these hidden globes are only going to become more common and more influential.
Are not going away.
So it's up to us, as citizens, as consumers, as investors, to engage with these issues, to demand transparency, to hold those in power accountable. We need to work towards a more just and equitable global system.
We can't just sit back and let things happen.
We've only scratched the surface of what the Hidden Globe has to offer in this deep dive. It's a book packed with insights, arguments, and examples that will really make you think. I highly recommend checking it out and exploring these ideas for yourself.
It's a journey worth taking.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Hidden Globe. We'll see you next time.